from the story workshop of Toby Disraeli, July 1961. The Indiana story. This yarn or story was told to me by my old friend Mary Shirley. She was born and brought up in Indianapolis. Her father was a prominent lawyer there. Well, when I say brought up in Indianapolis, that's really true, but I suppose as soon as she became of age, she started to travel. She was a very clever woman. She spent, because of those days, there wasn't such worldwide travel like today, but she'd go to the Sorbonne in Paris for 6 months to study, and she was a very literary person, although she never actually wrote anything, but I remember she did for many years do book reviews, very wonderful book reviews. Well, she was the only child, you see. Her father there was a prominent lawyer in Indianapolis and was very wealthy, made a lot of money. When she told me this story, what I call the Indianapolis story, her father was dead, passed on long ago, and it was kind of reminiscent, you see. I was then living in my hacienda. Hacienda is a Spanish word, I think, for a plantation or small plantation in the Philippines. I had several houses there, and coconuts, of course, and the one house was very beautiful. That's where I was living, and with a big veranda and shaded by these big coconut trees and tropical fruit trees and orchids clinging to the trees and even to the veranda. We were sitting there. You see, when she told me the story, she was 79 years old, you see. It's not so long ago, you see. She'd been living in one of those shabby places in New York, a Van Rensselaer hotel, and she was ailing, and so she ventured to come out to see me. I was a leftover from World War II, you see, and had acquired this plantation, this hacienda, and well, I suppose she had a longing to get away from New York. It was frightfully cold, and well, she came out bravely, you know, and got on a boat there in New York and came on out to Manila, and we picked her up, and she was installed in my place there. Well, I knew she was ailing, but mentally she was just as bright as a new pin. One day we were sitting on the veranda there, and one of the servants had brought her her favorite gin sling, Singapore gin sling, I think they called it, because I was my usual gin and bitters, a little bit of ice. But we were sitting there, and it was calm and peaceful. The rains were starting, you know, the monsoons, and you know how it blows and showers, and well, anyhow, we were secure and comfortable. I suppose you know how old people do reminisce. You know, she was talking about her early life in Indianapolis, and really what brought up the subject was she was lamenting the fact that she got so little money for her house in Indianapolis. Now, really, that's where this story is about. It's really a story about a street in Indianapolis. I'm going to mention the name of the street. I thought I wouldn't. I'd change it, but why? I'm not going to hurt anybody's feelings, I suppose, because I think most of the people involved are dead by now. Anyhow, I'll change the names of a few of them. The name of the street was Meridian Street. It was the most famous street in Indianapolis. And she had one of those great big mansions on there, where, as I say, she grew up with her father. Well, that had been sold, during the Depression for so little money. But when she was sitting there in the veranda with me, of course, she could have realized she should have gotten about 5 times as much money for that house. Well, this was the story she told me about Indianapolis in those days. Of course, it's very ragged, and it's only raw material for a story. It would have to be completely re-edited because it won't be put together. She rambled on, you know, just told me little bits, and because it's from memory now, I'm just repeating the story she told. It was Meridian Street. She described it. It was the finest street in Indianapolis, which was then a somehow or other a rich town. It was a beautiful street on Meridian, was of course was quite long at that time. On both sides of Meridian Street there were these big trees, and everybody had big houses there. They were really mansions. We'd call them mansions today. They were all built, I suppose, around 1900 or something around that time. They had big carriage houses at the side and big front gardens and big back gardens. Well, the best people, society people, lived there, and that's really what she was talking about. Everybody took great pride in their houses, especially in their gardens. They had the lawns were always trimmed, the lawns were always cut, and the hedges were always trimmed, and the flowers looked after, and of course all the leaves were swept up, and well, it was kind of civic pride, I suppose. And houses were, of course, magnificent houses, of course, all painted in those days, because they had Negro servants at that time. And so she said she grew up in that atmosphere. Everybody knew one another on Meridian Street. They were all, well, high society, I suppose. And of course she was very young at the time this all came about. She said, I'll tell you a funny story, she said, about, it really involves the ladies' auxiliary there in Indianapolis. She said, I was a little much too young to belong to it, but I never forget. She said, you see, there was one house there, it was a mansion. It wasn't very far from ours. It was owned by an old Lady Lamplow. They called her Lady Lamplow, which is really fairly true, because she did have relatives in England that I think belonged to the nobility. But she was a Mrs. Lamplow. She'd been a widow for many, many years. She had this very big house, and she lived with 2 Negro servants. But at that time she was about 80, and she couldn't hear anymore, and well, she passed on, leaving a great deal of money all to charity. But for some odd reason or other, as we found out, she left the house, that was the house on Meridian Street, to a nephew. Nobody had ever seen him, nobody had ever visited as far as we knew. And this nephew lived in the South, and well, he was left the house, but all the money, according to the lawyers, was left to charity, churches, and hospitals and institutions, schools. And well, eventually we were all, of course, curious. Anything that happened on Meridian Street, that was, you might say, our world. Anything that happened there, of course, was very important. Well, one day the nephew arrived. Well, he was a great shock, I guess. Some of the people on Meridian Street happened to be passing by when this carriage drove up with, well, the first thing one saw was all these cardboard bundles, not any luggage, massive cardboard bundles, and there was the driver there, and in the carriage was this very crummy, shabby-looking man. Well, he got out, and, well, the first impression he made on the people that saw him was like that French artist Lautrec. He was something wrong with his legs. He was misshapen and crummy looking, dirty, and not too tall, but in his arms he held an infant. There was no woman anywhere around, and well, everybody took a look at him as he passed by. He was a most unpleasant looking person, and very dirty and sort of crippled in some way, but yet he could walk all right. Well, he disappeared into the house with this infant in his arms. The baggage, what if you can call it that, was dumped on the porch by the driver, and well, that's the last we saw him. We heard his name was Dunker. For some reason or other, he was always called Old Man Dunker. That was spelled D-U-N-K-E-R. Very different from Lamplow, but well, that was his name, Dunker. The baby was, of course, his, and it was rumored almost from the beginning that the wife had died shortly after the baby was born, and well, there he was with the baby. Well, now this people were, of course, very curious about him. As a rule, then in a place like Indianapolis, you know, when some new people moved in, the ladies there, who had nothing else to do, of course, but well, I don't exactly know what they did, but Shirley told me that they either drove up in their electrics and carriages and left a card, and I forget, it was kind of to welcome the people, and then I think they eventually were invited back and forth to tea. At any rate, nobody drove up to old man Dunker's house. It made a very poor impression on his entree, you mean, on his entrance. Everybody had described him, said what an awful-looking man he was. And, well, there he was. Every now and again people would pass by and they'd see a big oversized wash basket on the porch. That's apparently where the baby was. And everybody kept away from him. And in fact, he very seldom came out. He had neither any servants, neither a carriage or anything. Now and again he'd been seen walking down to the town, to the grocery stores and the meat store. But after that, he seemed to become a kind of recluse. The grocery boy came once a week, and the butcher boy, and well, I suppose they spread the gossip around, because they would come to our houses too, it was all on Meridian Street, and they would tell our servants, or even tell the missus, about old man Dunker. That's what they called him. It seems that he lived off tripe and heart, cow's beef heart, and liver and kidneys from pigs and tripe, and well, certainly that's about all he seemed to order. The grocers were the very poorest, but anyhow, people wondered about this infant, you see, but nobody, of course, wanted to do anything just at that time. The butcher boy said that the baby didn't get any milk; it got just tripe soup, and in the bottle. At least that's what they said. Well, anything that happened on Meridian Street was our world, and of course everybody was interested. Well, the time went on, of course, and there was a good deal of civic pride amongst the people on Meridian Street, and everybody kept their gardens up. That was the one thing they had to do. And at that time, it was fashionable to have ornaments in the garden. In the house where old man Dunker was, Mrs. Lamplow had left it behind. It was a very large stag, kind of stag, animal there. It was made of iron, and it was sort of prancing. It was very beautiful. I don't know where she'd gotten it from, India or someplace. But other people had ornaments in their garden, and everybody kept them trimmed and beautiful. Well, everybody had admired the Lamplow garden. She had these coloured servants that, of course, always fixed it up. Well, when Dunker moved in, there was nothing done. The leaves fell, and they remained fallen, and the grass was uncut, and the hedge was overgrown, and well, it was very disgusting. I mean, one winter passed, and then the spring came again, and well, the garden looked terrible. In fact, there was one window had been broken. It was stuffed with paper. That was sort of one flight up, and in those days they heated with coal, and it was rumored that just old man Dunker had lived with this child in one or two rooms downstairs with a pot-bellied stove, because he only ordered very little coal. Well, at any rate, the groceryman came, and they used to see, the child's name happened to be Jimmy, little Jimmy, and well, Shirley told me that. She said, I was going to school at that time, and I didn't really pay a great deal of attention. Daddy was very busy. He was working for some big eastern corporations, Indianapolis. Indiana was then a growing state, and Daddy was very busy, and I'm getting rich. Well, at any rate, after maybe a year or so, it was the Ladies' Auxiliary. They were a group of, they were the most influential people on Meridian Street, you see. They were all rich, the wives of industrialists and important men there, and Shirley hated them. She said, I hate them, they're a nosy bunch. They call themselves the Ladies' Auxiliary, and she said they're always poking their nose into somebody else's business. But it was too powerful a group, I mean, there was civic virtue and charity and all these things, and the ladies took it upon themselves to manage that, because everybody was afraid of them. It was headed by a Mrs. Pothemus, that was spelled P-O-T-H-E-M-U-S or some name like that. Her husband was the director of the bank, and he had interest in a big glass company east. He was very rich too, and of course there was others. She did tell me the names of them, but I had forgotten. I only remember Pothemus because behind her back the tradespeople and the people that didn't like her used to call her the Pot, P-O-T. Well, when they were going to take some action and look into something, they would call a meeting, and usually at Mrs. Pottimus's house. And it seems that they'd become very disappointed with old man Dunker, as they called him. His garden was shocking. It was an eyesore to the whole neighborhood. Well, they called a meeting. They got together, and they decided to go and call on Mr. Dunker and see if he'd do something. And, well, it seems that it would become really very necessary at that time, because over the stag in the front garden, that beautiful iron stag, he had draped a very dirty blanket, I suppose it was. It was obviously soiled, and some attempt had been to wash it clean, but it was hanging there over the stag, over the stag's horns, and went all over. Well, that combined with the grass hadn't been cut in several years, 2 or 3 years or something, and the hedge was all overgrown, so certainly that blanket hanging over the stag was disgraceful. So the ladies decided, ladies auxiliary, they got in their electrics, and some of them had Haynes cars, I think, that was made in Indianapolis at the time, and others had with their carriages. Call on old Mr. Dunker. Mrs. Pottimus, she was always the head of the posse, you know. Well, they arrived at old man Dunker's house, and he happened to open the door. Well, he saw this posse of women. Well, I guess I won't remember what old Mrs. Pottimus said, but anyhow, old Dunker blew up like a frog. Moved his head back, and he shouted at them about to get off his property, that they had no business there, and not to stick their noses in his affairs, and he could do what he liked. That was his house, and for them to get the hell out. Well, that was an awful rebuff for the ladies' age, you know, because as a rule everybody was, small tradespeople or minor, offenders were very much afraid. That was the wealth and power of Indianapolis. Well, at any rate, they departed, and I don't think ever after that there was any actual interference with old man Dunker. Well, Shirley said, I went to school in the East, and I used to come home for holidays, and after a while, this little boy, Jimmy, was, he was growing up, he was around 5 or 6, and I passed by there once. The garden was terrible, but Jimmy was sitting on the back of the stag. He had a rope around its neck, and he was sort of galloping, pretending to. Anyhow, I thought it was an awful cute picture, but there was never any sight of old man Dunker. The tradespeople used to bring Jimmy lollipops and candy and cookies, and because when they would give him a nickel, he'd rush right in and say, I give it to Daddy. Well, and the old man would take it from the kid, everybody knew that. So the tradespeople, the only ones that ever got in the house, they only gave him candy. Well, as time went on, this Jimmy, this little kid, got to be, I suppose I was 10 or 11. How long you went to school in those days, I don't know, but we had seen him going to school with his shoes run down, sometimes one sock not matching the other, and shabby clothes, and full of sort of ragtag and bobtail child. And well, everybody took pity on him. He was a nice-looking child too, and very nicely spoken. Well, anyhow, when I suppose Jimmy could get out of school, he got a job. He was the errand boy for the grocery store, Mr. Wenger. I think he spelled his name Wenger, Wenger. He was a German. He ran the grocery store, kind of general store. And, well, Jimmy went to work for Mr. Wenger, so he used to call on us. So you see, he became sort of, well, in our street and a bit in our life, Everybody called him Jimmy, and there was no contact whatsoever with the old man Dunker. He had become a recluse in the house, and well, somebody did give Jimmy a few tips and requested that he clean up the garden, which he did very indifferently. But at any rate, time went on, and Jimmy was the runner there for the grocery store, and people just liked him. Well, at that time I was going to Bryn Mawr there in the East. That was a school in Massachusetts, and things went on very much the same. In Indianapolis, I think the people were getting richer, and I think by this time natural gas had come, and I remember now that all our houses were to be heated by natural gas, and Daddy was a natural gas lawyer, so he was getting richer all the time, and I was at Bryn Mawr, and well, like other girls, it was a very respectable school. I'd much sooner gone to Smith, but well, it wasn't quite. Daddy thought that Bryn Mawr was the place for young ladies. Well, you know, as they say, nothing ever changed. More houses were built on Meridian Street, got bigger and bigger, and the Ladies' Aid were more and more prominent. They all had their electrics, and I suppose they were getting on to better, you know, the newer cars. And well, I came home once, and as I say, we were talking about the street, Meridian Street, and the people that lived on it. This Jimmy had gotten to be around, well, he had gotten to be quite a big boy. I would know about 17 or 18. At any rate, he was working for this grocery store, and it seems just about that time, a man had opened a pool parlor not very far from the grocery store. Well, that was a bait for the Ladies' Aid. They had to see that there was no pool parlor in Indianapolis. That wasn't to get a foothold. Well, the old mayor there, Mayor Evans, he was always very much of great help to the ladies auxiliary, you know. I mean, he was just in with them. Well, he was a relative of Fighting Bob Evans, somebody by the name of Fighting Bob Evans. Well, old Mayor Evans had died, and there was a new mayor then. His name was Hickok. Well, of course, people called him Wild Bill Hickok, but anyhow, he was the new mayor, so the Ladies' Auxiliary went down to see him one fine day to stop this pool parlor, which was, nothing like that had ever been in Indianapolis. Well, I suppose Hickok, well, he was different. I suppose he had a finger in many things, and he listened to them very respectfully. He was a politician. He knew he wasn't going to, you know, where fools rush in, angels fear to tread. I mean, Hickok, well, he listened to them, and he said he'd see what he could do, and well, it turned out that, of course, maybe he was getting his bit. At any rate, he did nothing. He said that he pointed out to the ladies later on that they had a license from City Hall, and there was nothing he could do. Well, so the pool parlor got into Indianapolis, and near that by was a saloon. Well, I suppose that reminded me of the fact that Jimmy, this boy there, who was living with this recluse on our street, people used to see him going and coming. He'd never talk about his father, never say a word, and he was a secretive sort of boy. I suppose that was on account of his upbringing, and we'd see him going and coming. You see, there was some talk then amongst the people as to Dunker, old man Dunker. Some of them called him Dunker, but old man Dunker, there was little suspicion that he might have colored blood, you see. He came from the south, and he spoke with a very old, deep southern accent, and there was just something about that look about him that maybe he did, but that was only just talk, you know, at the time. Nobody, I think, had ever brought it out, but it just made conversation. At any rate, this Jimmy was accused of stealing from Mr. Wenger. That was, everybody was disappointed at that. He had gotten away with $200, and he had confessed that he took it. It was something to do with the pool hall and gambling on horses. Well, of course, he was kicked out, and everybody was very sorry about that. And well, then he went to work for some trucking company, and the pool hall flourished, and I suppose Mayor Hickok there, Wild Bill Hickok, I suppose he never interfered, and there was, I suppose, horse racing too, gambling, and some of the gambling went on in the pool room. It was a very big four tables, something like that, and well, Jimmy was our point of interest, I suppose, and he was rather an indifferent sort of person there, and there'd been a shooting in the pool parlor, and a ricochet bullet had killed one man, and it was evidently in connection with the track. And at any rate, Jimmy had been in jail. He had been arrested at the time, and well, that counted against him, I suppose, but although there was nothing ever proven, they never got the one that did it. The Jimmy was drinking at the time, and everybody knew that. Well, there were some people, there was a woman in the town, they all called her Mrs. McDougall. She's an old Irish woman. She did fine laundry for everybody on Meridian Street. Of course, only blouses and fine shirts. She wouldn't do sheets or anything like that. Well, she too was a character there known on Meridian Street. She had a very beautiful daughter named Rosanna, because Rosanna was small at that time when everybody first knew about Mrs. McDougall, but I suppose she sort of grew up with Jimmy, I suppose. At any rate, when Rosanna used to deliver the fine laundry, you know, and everybody knew her. Well, of course, she was a great beauty and a sweet girl. People didn't mind inviting her in, you know, and although, of course, they wouldn't ask her to sit down or anything like that, but they gave her little gifts. And, well, Mrs. McDougall was a prominent, very respectable person. So one day the news got out. This bum, Jimmy Dunker, had married Rosanna and had run away. Well, it almost broke Mrs. McDougall's heart, and of course everybody on Meridian Street heard it, and, well, they were deeply grieved. And Shirley said, you know, I remember at that time when they told us, I said, well, what a pity, because this Rosanna, well, if she had not been the daughter of a washerwoman, I mean, she could have made the grade in anywhere. But of course, in those days, you know, there was class, and after all, Rosanna was, her mother was a washerwoman, but she was a great beauty, beautiful figure, beautiful head, and, well, I suppose here she just fell prey to this bum Jimmy, and well, it almost broke Mrs. McDougall's heart at any rate. Well, they went to live in a few rooms above Mrs. McDougall, and it was believed that she'd supported them. The story went around that when Jimmy married her, and he took her home to the house on Meridian Street, that came as a surprise to old man Dunker. Well, he flew into one of the most terrible rages you can ever imagine. He threw them both out. He wouldn't allow them across the doorstep. He says, don't you ever enter this house again. Don't you ever darken these doors again. He says, wait there. And he says, I'll give you whatever belongs to you. And he threw out onto the veranda there the meager belongings of Jimmy, and he cursed this girl. And when they had gone, he must have gone into Jimmy's place where he lived, and he threw out all his toys or his belongings right onto the lawn. Jimmy disappeared, of course, with Rosanna, but it seems that amongst these things he threw out was a bobsled, and with such violence he threw it all around the big stag, a beautiful big metal stag, and the sleigh had knocked off the front leg, which was sort of held in a pantsing sort of high, and that knocked off by the sleigh. The sleigh lay there, and the poor stag there with his leg off, and, well, everybody saw all the toys around there, and nothing could be done about it, and, well, Jimmy was out of the house forever with Rosanna. Well, of course, as time went on, I suppose Rosanna was pregnant, and she had a baby was born. They also named it Rosanna. I think that old Lady McDougall died shortly after the baby was born of a broken heart. I mean, she was disgusted with Jimmy and what had happened to poor Rosanna. At any rate, the people there on Meridian Street, there was a collection there for old Mrs. McDougall. And of course, everybody knew her there. She'd done laundry for everybody, and everybody contributed $5 or $10 or maybe more, and for the respectable funeral of Mrs. McDougall. Well, that was how Mrs. McDougall passed away, and that just left Jimmy, this bum, and who was then by actually taking bets. I mean, he was in the racing business, and, well, his poor wife, little Rosanna, who was taking on laundry and doing fine work, and a dressmaker came to town. It seems that there was a small house not terribly far from Meridian Street, but it wasn't on a good street. It was on a rather shabby street, and a sign was hung out. It said Etta Bunner. Now that's very important, because this was the part of the story that Shirley told me that intrigued me. The name was E-T-T-A, I suppose an abbreviation of Henrietta. The other name was Bunner. Bunner. Now, I said, my goodness, I said, Shirley, what a name, Etta Bunner. Yes, it's right. He says, it's an Etta Bunner dressmaker. Nothing else, a very modest sign. And a small house that had been vacant for some time. Well, I don't know who discovered, as Shirley said, Etta Bunner. But somebody did, and it was somebody on Meridian Street, one of the ladies. Well, Etta Bunner's star was to rise. And I think for a short period where it had to set a bit, it rose to the highest heavens. At any rate, Etta Bunner, she does need a little bit describing. She was about 22, certainly not more. She had her hair pulled back in a bun, but obviously very, very good looking. She had blue eyes and blonde hair, but she never used any lipstick or any powder and any perfume, but she had a most perfect figure you can imagine. She had rather, at that time, very full breasts, you know. She was a real sweater type, but narrow hips and as straight as a die. Oh, she was really, but certainly made nothing of it. If she was a great beauty, but she was what you call striking, stand out anywhere. Well, that wasn't the reason for Etta's popularity. She was the most wonderful dressmaker you could ever imagine. The ladies had discovered her, and of course the ladies, as Shirley told me there as we were sitting, I was drinking my gin on the veranda there, she said, you know, those women, they were awfully potty, you know, very big, you know, from all the whipped cream, and she said, you know, whenever they make desserts there in those days in Indianapolis, we'd have a big 3 or 4 course dinner. Even some of the vegetables were cooked in cream, but when it came to dessert, there'd be a big pastry or pie and topped off with tons of whipped cream, and you never saw it. They went in for it, butter, and well, they were all out of shape, you know. Well, they couldn't get clothes anyhow in the, that fine store there in Indianapolis. So Etta Bunner was their lifesaver. Well, everybody remembers Etta Bunner as this very straight-looking, very clean-looking individual with a mouth full of pins and a green apron around full of needles, stuck in needles, and a tape measure around her neck. And as the ladies drove up in their electrics, or maybe they were getting Cadillacs at that time, or locomobiles. I had a locomobile at that time. At any rate, they would drive up, and Etta Bunner she was there. She was their dressmaker. Oh, and how they praised her. I mean, there was one. Did Etta Bunner make that? Yes. Well, the ladies just gave them something. Well, Etta Bunner was to become well, everybody loved her, you know. They just thought she was perfectly wonderful, you see. There was, seeing that she came from the deep south, you see, in Indianapolis those days, they were all a bit suspicious. She was a nice-looking person, but they just wondered who she was or where she came from. And in her case, there was no question about Aryan, there was no question that she was. And then anyway, it was octoroon. That was out of the question. She was much too American, but there was something English about her, they figured. At any rate, she was very stunning looking, but certainly nobody ever mentioned that except, it just wasn't mentioned. Only her art as a dressmaker, the most wonderful dressmaker that ever came to Indianapolis. Well, then, by this time, this Jimmy, to go back to Jimmy, I'd come back from the Bryn Mawr then. I was nearly through, and when I got back, I heard all about Etta Bunner, although Shirley said I never had any dresses made by her, but she said I had seen her, and she was a very nice-looking person, and I was always amused at the name. I said, yes, that name is a wonder. I said, that deserves a story. And well, she said she certainly had one. Well, I said, anyhow, I figured she'd tell me about Etta Bunner. It seems about that time that this wife of Jimmy, his name also was Rosemary, had died of anemia, and I think overwork. She was looking after little Rosemary, and of course Jimmy was a bum, and the mother had died, and so, well, it was, people sort of took up a collection to, well, that left little Rosemary, who was then about 3 or 4, maybe going on 4.5, with just Jimmy, you see. Well, they stayed on apparently in this house. There was a woman in the house there downstairs that took in washing, and people used to see this little Rosemary on the street there with dirty little clothes on. At any rate, Etabanna's star was rising, and everybody loved her, and everybody was having, that is the prominent women there, you know, Mrs. Pothemus and all the rest, you know, and society was going on there, you know. There was, as Shirley tried to tell me, they had parties there, you know, from one house to another. There was nothing else to do. That was all part of the social life in Indianapolis, which really wasn't bad. It was really quite nice, and the people were becoming richer, you see, all the time, because now natural gas had come, and of course the telephones were everywhere, and new cars were coming, and I think electrics were being disposed of. Shirley told me, says, you know, I had an electric and I just loved it. She said, I used to be able to back it up to the curb. You know, it drives along like a snake. Oh, beautiful. I'd like one today, in fact. You can't go 110 miles an hour in it. Well, at any rate, just where were we? Oh, yes, Etabanna's star was almost very high, and Jimmy, of course, was now a widow, this bum, and, well, there was little Rosanna playing on the street, and there was this washerwoman downstairs, and Jimmy was making book. Well, that was, I suppose, a cause for the ladies auxiliary. They called a meeting. Whenever they were going to get into something, they had to call a meeting first. It was always with a party, you know. Well, they said, this is immoral. This child there, going on 5 years old, this little girl with that man, and they're living in 1 or 2 rooms. This man is no good, and although he's the father, but he's drunk and very often, and he's totally disreputable, and we ought to do something. Well, it was decided that they should certainly do something about it. Well, they figured they'd go down and they would try to take the child. Well, first of all, they decided what to do with the child. Well, none of them, of course, the high society, thought for a moment of taking the child into their house. See, they reasoned this way. Old man Dunker, as it was generally believed, although their husbands had warned them never to be shooting off their mouth about that, their old man Dunker was maybe coloured, or half-coloured at any rate. You know, a kind of octoroon, or... Well, of course, there was no proof of this, so they're like my daddy, who was sometimes called in by the ladies' auxiliary for advice. He had once warned them that be very careful, don't say things like that. Well, at any rate, they were reasoning amongst themselves. They figured, well, if old man Dunker had this coloured blood, but then Jimmy had it, and then, of course, let me see, Jimmy, then, of course, there was the little girl Rosanna he married, but he was the father of this little Rosanna now, the 5-year-old, and she would therefore be sort of QED, coloured blood. Well, you know how these old women were, these ladies' auxiliaries. So, well, they thought the best thing they could do would be to put the child in the poorhouse. There was a kind of institution there, put little Rosanna in there, where they reasoned she'd be brought up and taken care of, and they claimed they were taxpayers, and every year they paid so much for this this refuge for children, and so they figured, well, they were very mean, of course. Not one of them thought it was a very beautiful little girl, but oh no, they wouldn't take her into the house on account of this vague possibility of coloured blood, which was doubtful anyhow. But at any rate, this one day they got into their limousines and descended on this address where Jimmy was. Well, they didn't see little Rosanna on the street, as had been reported, and the washerwoman came to the door. Her arms full of soap suds. She was wiping them, and she saw this array outside. Oh, she says, that kid, that Rosa, she ain't here anymore. Well, she said, well, here comes Jimmy. You better ask him, he knows. Well, Jimmy came on up, and the ladies' auxiliary told him that the ladies' auxiliary, and they felt that it wasn't right for this child to be with him, that after all, they didn't have to tell him about his reputation, but they just told Jimmy that they wanted to take the child, and it was a civic duty for them to look after this child. Well, Jimmy sort of seemed impassive, and he says, well, I'm sorry, it's too late. He says, she's gone. Well, the lady said, well, where did she go? Then Jimmy says, well, a lady took her and going to give her a good home. Well, Mrs. Pothemus, she always led the posse, you know. We called those women when they descended on some place or some gambling, whatever they went to interfere with, a kind of posse. And so Mrs. Pot says, well, where? Oh, she's a lady by the name of Etabana. Well, that sort of stunned them. There was nothing more they could say, so back into their Cadillacs and off to Etabana's place. Well, everybody knew that Etabana she'd painted her house, and she'd made a perfectly beautiful garden out of what was a rubble heap. And well, Etabana was, of course, very successful at the time too, although the lights burnt in her house till 10 o'clock at night every night. Well, they ladies descended on her. They were familiar with her. She came out with the usual green apron full of pins and mouth, and she saw that the lady, she thought maybe it was about to dress, and then came out little Rosanna, dressed like a princess, about 5, hair done up, little ribbons on her, scarlet ribbons in her hair, and just like a princess. Little pretty dress, sort of rather high, you know, and several petticoats and sweet little socks, and she came bouncing out. Well, of course, that was Rosanna. Well, Etabana says, yes, I knew the case there, you know. I realized that it was a pity for that little child to be there because, you know, they have drunken brawls there. And so she says, I've taken little Rosanna. Well, I don't know what the ladies said. I don't think they liked it because they still wanted her to put her in the home. Well, that evidently they retreated, and there was another convention, you know, at home. So, well, Etabana. Well, by the way, before they left, Etabana had taken them in and showed them little Rosanna's new bedroom. Oh, she had decorated it with bunnies and pixies, and there was a statue in there, and her little bed, and Etabana said she was making her pretty dresses, and she said, you know, when she came, she had nothing. She was filthy, lice in her hair. She said, oh, didn't have a rat. She said, I burnt them all up in the fire. Well, here she was now, little princess, and Etabana. Well, it was the ladies they didn't really like it, but they just had to accept it, you see.